Continuing our theme of the book of Proverbs on Sunday nights, it came time for this opportunity. These young men, it seemed proper and altogether right that we think about Proverbs 22, verse 6. And I am most happy to participate in young men leading service. I have been a young man doing it for a long time. And so I'm glad still to be in that number. Now, one of the things that we found when I was teaching this class up at the Bible Institute, Dry Ridge, was that oftentimes these proverbs, when you look at them a little more closely, you find things that maybe don't seem to have been there. You didn't find them just by looking at them in one place. It takes a little effort to figure out what's going on. And this is a verse that we've all looked at many times. Sometimes in figuring out what a verse means, you have to figure out what it does not mean first. Well, this never was intended by God. Solomon never intended it to be true, that it's a guarantee. If you do this, 100% guarantee says this is what will happen. That's not what this means. And so with that in mind, then, let's think for a minute about what it does mean. And I can say that the older guy in the bunch forgot to send up the PowerPoint. That's why you don't have one. So there you go. And I spent a lot of time working on that too. I can tell you about it. It was a chalkboard with chalk writing on it. It's pretty cool. Anyway, all right, look at the verse. Found a couple of things I had never noticed before in the verse. Number one, train up a child. The word train there comes from a word that is used 17 times in the Old Testament. And all 16 other times besides this one, it is translated dedicate. Does the meaning change in your mind when you read it that way? Dedicate a child to the way that he should go. And when he is old, he won't depart from it. The intention of the word is a word that says, point them in the right direction. Literally, Solomon was saying to parents, give your child to the Lord first. First. Every child that is born into a Christian family will not remember this, but every parent should dedicate that child to the Lord. Give the child to the Lord. You remember when Hannah wanted a child so badly in the Old Testament. She said, if you'll let me have a child, a man child, a son, I'll give him to you. Literally, that came true, as you know, because he went to live in the temple and learn eventually to be a judge of the people of God. Every family should say, we are dedicating our children to the Lord. I'm going to point them in the right direction. Here's a second thing I found that I had not noticed. Train up a child in the way that he should go. This was the more fascinating part. The word there, he should go, comes from a word that means mouth. Mouth. The Hebrew lexicon describing the word said it is a word of discipline, and even used the phraseology, it is like putting a rope in a horse's mouth. Could it be translated this way? Dedicate, give your child's mouth to the Lord. Now, what is the point? I think using that word, built on the word mouth, was intended for them to see or to hear the concept of the bridle that's in the horse's mouth that steers in the proper direction. God is using through Solomon the wisdom of telling parents, you give your child to the Lord by putting a bit in his mouth so that you can direct him in the proper way. Now, if we implant that bit and point them in the right direction, we have done all that we can do to say, and they will not depart from it. This verse, however, does not take away their free will. I understand that. This is, of course, the ideal. Here is something else it is saying. If you don't dedicate your children to the Lord, and if you don't put something in their mouth and point them the right way, it is likely the case they won't go in the right direction. Now, of course, there are some children who've never been taught by their parents, but they come to the Lord anyway. So these are not meant to be absolute statements, but rather guidance and principle that, as it were, stack things in the favor of doing what is right. Two phrases we use a lot, and then the lesson will be yours. One, leaders are made, not born. Let's imagine that leaders were born, not made. Then as a church or as a society, we could just sit around and wait until someone rose up. And there would come a time when that person, because they were born that way, not made that way, they eventually would get to the point where they would come to us and say, okay, I'm ready to lead. And we let them go. That's what would happen if leaders are born, not made. But the contrary is true. They are made, not born. And if that is true, and it is, then we cannot, parents, society, church, just sit around and wait for them to say, I'm ready to lead. We can't just sit back and think, oh, they will get the leadership by some kind of osmosis. They will figure it out. They will come to it. And eventually they will be our leaders. We'll just sit back and let it happen. And it won't happen. Leaders are made, not born. Number two, as go the children, so goes the church. The Lord's church, in a universal sense, is dependent upon the youth in the universal congregations of the Lord's people. In other words, the leaders all over the world with respect to Christianity That universal church is waiting because those young people are going to be doing that. More particularly, leaders in local churches or churches, local congregations are waiting and dependent upon the youth who one day will lead the church. That is an obvious statement. It is one of those statements that you say, it is so obvious I don't even need to say it. But if it's that obvious, then why are so many places not training their young people to lead? Why is it that in so many places, truly, they're just sitting back and letting it happen? A man who taught at Harding University for a number of years, Flavel Yakeley, is a statistician by training. And he wrote a book where he had done a whole lot of research amongst us in order to determine what is it that we need to do to keep our young people faithful to the Lord. There are a few things that he found that I find to be rather interesting. One, across the board, from the study was from 1997 until 2006. I don't know that he's done a more previous one, possibly some edited versions, but this is the material that I have. And he said, across the board, only 58.2% of our young people are remaining faithful to the Lord. 58.2%. In a household of 5 children, 3 stay faithful and 2 are lost. Would parents sit back and go, oh well, those are the statistics. I kept 3 of them, 2 of them are gone, oh well. So then he said, what can we do? What can we do? What is being done? Again, to stack things in the favor of them being faithful. What's involved in this dedicating their mouths to the Lord? The first thing he noticed was this. There are among our young people who go to college and get an education at a Christian university. At that time, 85% were staying faithful to the Lord. 85. Now, when you look over here, here's another percentage that he found that I thought was really interesting. He said, among our children who go off to college at a public university that has an active campus ministry, we are retaining 85%. In other words, we better keep this going. Because our brethren who send their children here need us. And not only that, they need us to do better, to do more. That statistic was interesting. Here's another one that will interest parents. In homes where both parents had an identifiable job that was their responsibility in the local congregation. Bible teacher, janitor, secretary, whatever it is, when both parents are doing something identifiable, 75 to 80% of their children were staying faithful to the Lord. If they have two parents, but only one is actually doing much, that percentage dropped to 50%. And when you had two parents in the congregation, a part of the church, but neither one of them actively responsible for anything at all, only 20% stayed faithful to the Lord. Brethren, we better be about the business of encouraging our parents of children to do things that their children can see them doing. It helps their spiritual commitment. He then summarized all of his findings. And he said these things to local churches. Number one, have an active youth ministry. The vast majority of young people who remained faithful to the Lord after leaving high school came out of congregations that have an active youth ministry. Now, here's what that means. Here's how I identified it. They have other things going outside of Sunday morning, Sunday night, Wednesday night. That's what he means. We have such an outreach. We have such a ministry. There is opportunity abounding for our young people to be involved in things outside of our assembly times. It is up to parents and those young people to see to it that they do, if they have dedicated themselves to the Lord. Here's a second thing. This one surprised me. He said, if you want to raise children that leave your congregation and stay faithful to the Lord, have a vibrant adult Bible class program. Not a child program. He said those children's programs are good. They all learn the stuff. They do pretty well. He said an adult program. And I thought about that. What in the world is he talking about? Here's what he says. If you have an active, mind-stretching adult program, parents are able to talk to their children on deeper soil than just up here. They're able to answer their children's tough questions. They are able to see their parents dealing with difficult topics, chewing the meat instead of just being satisfied with the milk. We better be about the business of ensuring that we have an active, vibrant, deep Bible study curriculum for adults. And I'll tell you, we need your input for that. We need you to tell us the kinds of deeper topics that we need to be studying. We need you to have input, and you're going to get that opportunity very soon to give us input on these kinds of things. The third thing he said, perfect sense, makes perfect sense. You want your children to stay faithful. Parents, stay involved. I'll tell you what he meant. Involved did not mean coming on Sunday morning and sitting in a pew. That's not what he called involvement. Well, that's not this group. What he called involvement was parents actively participating in the work of the church. Again, having an identifiable responsibility, something that you need to do in order for it to be done, keeps your children faithful to the Lord. As go the children, so goes the church. These young men represent just a small portion of the kind of training that has been going on and that will continue to go. Richmond Training for Service is going to be the terminology that we want to use. And we want to invite you to help us all work together to train our young people. We're going to do this type of thing on an ongoing and regular basis this next year. At least once a quarter, maybe every other month, we'll have these young men involved. We also want to create and have opportunities. I really appreciate the Ladies' Day that Letha French was doing this past time and used some of our young ladies. They reached out to them to do the same thing with those older ladies. We need to have those kinds of opportunities. We want you to help us help them by teaching them to do service projects. If that's something that you really enjoy, you like serving and working with people in need or just to lend a helping hand, let's put together some things to let young people go and be involved. Let's train them to serve. There are ways that we can train our young people to use their talents for the Lord through audio-video things, through bulletin boards in our classrooms. There are all kinds of things that we can do to train our young people to serve. If you serve here, if there's something you're doing in service to this church, figure out a way to train one of our young people to do the same thing. You may find that some of these young people have interest in the very area that you are working in. Why not take them along and say, come learn about this with us? I know my grandkids rode the bus tonight to McCready to pick them up. I'm going to tell you something. That seems small, but it's huge. Huge. Because when I was a kid, little bitty thing, my dad put me on the bus that we were driving around picking up people. It's huge. Dads, when you volunteer to drive the bus to McCready, take your children with you. Maybe if you don't have children, you're older, take somebody else. Train them to serve. There are all kinds of ways we can do this. Here's the point. We better get busy doing it. It's not that we haven't. We can always do better. And I want you to hear Richmond Training for Service. I don't want us to have the mentality that we are training our young people to go to Louisville to the Last Leaders Convention. It's not what we're doing. We're training our young people to work and serve the Lord in this place. And if they want to use that outlet, that will be available. But we're going to do it whether that happens or not, because God expects us to do it. He wants us to dedicate them to the Lord. Let us all, in our own minds, decide tonight. Parents, dedicate your children to the Lord. Grandparents, dedicate your grandchildren to the Lord. All adults, help us dedicate all these young people to the Lord, because souls are at stake. The end of that verse says, he will not depart from it, because departing is not good. Departing says, I've left the Lord behind. Some people have never taken on the Lord. I had an interesting experience this morning. A young man who happens to be Andrew Worley's roommate had been in a Bible study with another young man. He came to me this morning and says, I want to be baptized. I didn't even know him hardly at all. We sat in the room, talked a while. There was no way to keep that young man from obeying the gospel, because he realized, he said, I've been wrong. I've not been with the Lord. We have to get with the Lord before we ever could depart from him. Tonight, if you're not with the Lord, would be a great time. And if you've departed in some way or need strength and courage to come back, we want to give you that opportunity. Let's stand and sing together.
Sing, sound this word, praise the Lord, the heaven hath waited, all who linger, all who fall, sing it o'er and o'er again. Christ receive us sinful men, the sinners receive us sinful men,
couple of things for you before, while we're training young men for service, we've got to train them to make announcements, because somebody's got to do it. So they're going to do it. I have a couple for you. One, tonight, two or three at least of these young men did something in public worship they've never done before. So they've stretched themselves. And that's what we